Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Richard Coleman. I'm the UK General Insurance Managing Director here at Ecclesiastical Insurance. I say here at Ecclesiastical Insurance, but of course I'm working from home, as many of our colleagues has been since March 2020, striving to continue to provide the same high level of support around underwriting, insurance and risk management as we always have. However, we recognise that some needs facing churches and communities at the current time go beyond those, and we're seeking to provide support around acquiring funding to manage the ongoing day-to-day needs of running your church and community. So we've been using our resources to step beyond that usual role to provide a range of resources that support churches with their fundraising activities, and that whole range can be found in our new online fundraising hub, ecclesiastical.com/church fundraising. This webinar today is presented in collaboration with fundraising specialist Philanthropy Company. For the past 18 years, they've been working with a range of organisations and charities, particularly in the faith, church and heritage sectors. And I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Andrew Evans. Andrew's worked with churches of many denominations and sizes, including Christchurch, Liverpool, where he led the church through a major building programme and the set of 5 new church congregations. I'm also pleased to be joined by Jeremy Knowles. Jeremy is Grants and Relationships Manager at All Churches Trust, and he'll be giving the insights from a grant funder's perspective. So before I hand over to Andrew, I need to cover just a few housekeeping items. Firstly, I'm sure you'll recognise that all the guidance we give in today's webinar is correct at the time of recording. Obviously, it is a very fast-moving situation and things may change in the future. Secondly, at the end of the session, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions of Andrew. And if you want to do so, just look under the video. You'll see a small box entitled Ask a Question. And put your question in there, please. And then finally, if you miss anything during today's webinar, don't worry, we'll be sending around a link with the video recording, and you can go back and watch that again at any time. So without any further ado, let me hand over to Andrew, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Well, welcome and thank you for taking the time to join our webinar today. I hope this can be really useful to you in improving the way that you do monitoring and evaluation, both with the success of projects that you're already doing and in introducing perhaps this to people for whom it's completely new and you're thinking about projects that you are going to do in the future. My name is Andrew Evans. I'm an associate with Philanthropy Company who are working with Ecclesiastical to produce this series of webinars. I advise a range of clients on a wide variety of fundraising issues with them. But I've also been a church planter, a church pastor and church leader. I'm an active member of my local parish church at St Michael and All Angels here in Chester. So I understand some of what you're going through from both sides, as it were. This is a webinar that's really all about the results of the work that you do. We're going to look at a whole bunch of terms that you might have seen in documents from funders, like outputs and outcomes and impact reporting. We're going to try and understand what those things mean and how you can use them for yourselves for funding applications and in reporting back to funders who are interested in your work. We're going to cover 6 different things in our webinar today. We're going to think about understanding some of the words that are used in this little world of impact reporting. We're going to help you think about deciding what you're going to measure and report on. We're going to think about how you measure those outputs and outcomes, and then what you actually do once you've got the money in terms of reporting back to funders. Finally, we're going to think about the context of coronavirus and the things that happen there. And then we're going to think about the one thing that really matters. Then there's going to be about 15 minutes for questions at the end. We've got loads to cover, so let's crack on. As the process of making grants for projects has become more competitive over many decades, understandably, funders have wanted some mechanism to try and understand what results they're getting for their money. And essentially, the language that you'll see, all those terms there, investing, evaluation, impact, output, social return on investment, all that stuff, is all about finding ways to measure the difference that a project has made in the world so that you can meaningfully compare it to the things that other projects have achieved. So to help them make good decisions, grant makers, particularly big grant makers like the National Lottery Heritage Fund, will often ask you to think about and estimate numerically things that you think are going to happen as a result of your project. and then they'll ask you to put those things in your application. There's really three most important terms that it's going to be helpful for you to understand. The first one of those is outputs. Outputs are the services or goods that you deliver. So say you're running a food bank, an output would be that you will deliver or collect or have collected 50 food parcels per week. If you're doing a building project, an output would be that you will build a new church hall with 200 square meters of additional space and a new kitchen. So outputs are the kind of simple things, really, the services or goods that you deliver in the project. The outcomes are a bit more complicated. The outcomes are the difference that your outputs will make. So to take our food bank example, an outcome would be that the families receiving food can afford both to heat their homes and feed their children because they've had one of those 50 food parcels that were your outputs. Or in the building project example, an outcome would be that more people will come to more youth work sessions and they will be less lonely and isolated than they were before. You'll notice that you've got less control over outputs than you have over outcomes. So if somebody gives you all the money you need, you should definitely be able to build the new church hall and create that 200 square meters of extra space. But you cannot guarantee that young people will come to your youth work, and even less that your intervention will stop them feeling isolated, because there are so many other factors at play. Equally with the food bank example, you might deliver all those 50 parcels, but some families might have huge debts to pay off and still not be able to afford to pay their electricity bill. Third thing you need to think about is impact reporting. Impact reporting is the process of measuring and letting people know about your outputs and especially about your outcomes. So it's the reporting bit where you tell people about it. Now, having given you those three definitions, I do want to just introduce a little note of caution, which is that this is quite a new field and some of the terms are still sort of settling down. And what that means is lots of people, including funders sometimes, use those terms a bit less precisely than they should do, which can be a bit confusing. So whenever you come across them, just kind of read around and check what it is you think they're asking for. Okay, next we're going to think about deciding what you're going to measure and report on. How do you decide which of the things that will happen as a result of your project to include in a funding bid? Well, my advice is always to start from the end. So your first question should always be, what difference do we actually want to make in people's lives? What are the outcomes we actually want this project to have? Very many church projects, if we're honest, start with something that we want just because it would be nice to have. So, give you an example. I was working with one church recently who wanted to do a major extension and a reordering. And when you boiled it down, the main driver for coming up with that project was that they didn't want to have to move the chairs in the church from the nave every week for the toddler group to use that space. Now, I gently tried to point out to them that this probably wasn't a compelling reason for spending the best part of £3 million. So in the end, we looked instead at the difference they really wanted to make in their community to children and families and young people, and ended up redesigning a project that had much more emphasis on employing a couple of staff and training lots of volunteers and delivering a range of work with different groups of people, not just in their church, but in other places like local schools and care homes. See, if you start with the outcomes, what do I really want to happen? I don't know, for example, young people in our parish will feel safer and they have somewhere to go where they are understood, resulting in reduced levels of stress and anxiety. Having something like that will then help you design a better project in the first place. You'll actually design a project that does the thing you really want to do. All Churches Trust has got a really helpful project planning tool that takes exactly that approach, and there's a link to that on the slide there. So it's always a great idea to start with your outcomes. What do you really want to achieve? When you've done that, then you can go back and think about the outputs. So, for example, the thing you might do with the money that you're given is employ sessional youth workers to run a daily drop-in between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. every day, because your aim is to reduce isolation and loneliness. So you've got something that happens every day and it's free for anybody who's feeling like they needed to come. Your outputs and your outcomes are aligned with each other. Okay, so once you've decided what that output is, you may need to think, well, how many people is it for? How many people are you going to reach with this piece of work, with these sessional youth workers coming in every day? And you might come up with something like an average of 10 young people, or was it every day, representing over 100 different young people during the year, because some will come loads and some will come only once or twice. And that represents 80% of the 11 to 18-year-olds resident in the parish. Now, obviously, your example might differ slightly, but you get the idea. Next thing to do is to sense check everything that you've done so far. So your first question to ask is, do the outputs look reasonable for the cost? Does it look like we could deliver the thing we say we're going to for the amount of money we're spending and the other resources we've got available, like the number of volunteers? Does this look like good value? So, for example, I was working on one project with a church where their figures came out that they were building a church hall to be used by 200 different people, and it cost £2 million. That's £10,000 for every person who uses it, which is a lot of money. Whereas another project that I've worked on recently was for refurbishing our big city centre church building, and that cost twice as much as a £4 million project, but the building was already being used by about 10 or 12,000 different people every single year. So its costs were £350 to £400 a person, which obviously, if I'm a funder, looks like much better value. So do the outputs look reasonable for the cost? And then the next question to ask is, well, are the outcomes a logical result of the outputs? So it's no use saying that your project is going to hold one lunch a month for older people, but that your outcome is that it's going to engage and help 500 older people become less lonely, unless you've got a really huge lunch venue. Similarly, a project that's aimed at over 70s probably isn't going to have the outcome of increasing employment in your area. So you need to ask, are the outcomes the logical results of the output? Then you need to go, are the outputs clearly attainable? So if we get this money, can we build this building? If we get this money, can we employ this staff member? Now, obviously, unforeseeable events, and we all know about those this year, don't we, might knock your outputs off track. But in general, you should always be able to meet your outputs if you've got the funding that you're applying for. Now, of course, outcomes are more uncertain. They need to be ambitious, but achievable. So saying that 2 people are going to come to your youth work isn't an outcome that's going to inspire any funder to believe that you're really behind the project. On the other hand, saying that you're going to end poverty in your parish is unachievable. Your outcomes need to be ambitious, but achievable. No funder is going to be cross with you if you miss your targets slightly, but you should be kind of in the ballpark. Most of all, though, the things you choose to include as outputs and outcomes should be the things you really want to do. Designing things that are only there to please funders or because you think it's what somebody wants to hear is a route to disaster. Okay, so you've decided what you're going to measure and report on. The next question is, how are we going to measure it? Now, some outcomes, like how many people turn up to a particular activity, are pretty straightforward. You'll just need some sort of process or system in place to ensure that there's a count made at your weekly youth group or toddler group or whatever it is, and that's recorded week by week. But there are a whole bunch of other things that can be measured by asking people. So, for example, if you said as an outcome that young people are going to feel safer and they'll have somewhere to go where they are understood, then 6 months into your project, you could do a questionnaire with all the young people who have come to your project and ask them how the project has made them feel. Do they feel like it's safe? Do they feel understood? Now, obviously, you have to design the questions carefully so as not to be misleading or to just get the answer you think you want to hear. But you can design things to actually help you understand the outcomes that are being achieved. And of course, some of your outcomes, I don't know, how many older people stay in their own home longer because there's a lunch club that they can come to, are just not measurable. That doesn't mean that you're not having any impact. It just means there are so many other factors at play that it's really hard to measure them. So think of ways in which you can measure the outputs and the outcomes that you've decided you want to have. And then a really helpful way of sort of dealing with that and taking it to the next step is to produce a bit of a table. I've got an example here. I'll just talk through one of the things on that table. Once you've decided on these outcomes and outputs, You can then just create a table and say, this is how we're going to measure them. So take the first example on the little table we've got here. You've decided that your outcome is that your Youth Connect work is going to grow in capacity so young people have somewhere to go as an alternative to risky or antisocial behaviours, and that there'll be a decrease in antisocial behaviour in your town or parish. Now, this is a real example from a church that I've actually worked with recently. Then you're going to try and set a bit of a target value, both for maybe a year after your project started and for 5 years after it started. So in this example, the church decided that after a year, they would aim to see a 20% increase in attendance at their youth work from the current number average to 42, and that 80% of the people who turned up to the group would report that they found that group helpful when they were surveyed. Their target value for 5 years was that there would be a 100% increase in attendance from the amount they were getting at the moment. They get 70 people instead of the 35 they were getting today. And that 85% of the young people will report that they find the group helpful. And then, of course, you need to say, how are we going to measure that? Well, the answer is they were going to have a weekly count of attendance, and they were also going to liaise with the police about the figures for antisocial behaviour in their area. They didn't set a target for that because it was too complicated, but they were just trying to show how they were actually engaging with actually measuring whether they were achieving things. And then they were going to measure the helpfulness of the group by getting the young people to self-report through a regular survey. In a real project, you might have more than the 3 examples that I've got here. You might have a table which is a side of A4, maybe 6 or 7 different outcomes you want to have, what you're aiming to achieve, the target values, and how you're going to measure that. Okay, so you've done that. You've decided what you want to measure. You've decided how you're going to measure it. You've put in a bunch of funding applications that say so, and then you've got some grants that actually enable you to do that work. What do you do next? What do you do when you've got the money? How do you actually deliver this stuff? Well, those grant makers that ask you to state those things that will happen, to give them outputs and outcomes, they'll generally ask you to complete a piece of reporting either at the end of the project, that's usually for building projects or for things that last for less than a year, or if you've got a grant maybe over 3 years to deliver a youth work project, they'll ask you to report annually. This is why it's really important to have agreed your outputs and your outcomes before you make the application, and to have everyone in your church on board with delivering the things you said you were going to deliver. So if half your team are actually trying to achieve something different from the thing you said to the funder, it is very unlikely that at the end of the year, you're going to be able to report good news. And then you should also use the indicators that you said, maybe how many people are going to come or how helpful they're going to find it, not just once a year when the funder wants them reported, but much more often than that. Depending on the project, you might want to review every week, every month, or every quarter to help you see if you're on the right track. Let's give you an example. If you've got a lunch club and it's not getting the number of people you said it would, do you need to revisit what day it's on? Maybe there's competition and there's another lunch club that day. Do you need to look at the price or the publicity or the transport arrangements? If you set realistic targets at the beginning, they're a really valuable tool in helping you to ask good questions about what is going wrong or what is going right. Now, of course, most funders that give you grants won't ask for formal reporting. Now, they won't insist that you have particular outputs and outcomes and report back on them. But it's still a really good idea to make sure you write to them once the project is completed or once a year and let them know what you've achieved. Again, the All Churches website has a really helpful tool for doing this, which you can access at the address on the slide here. I don't think I'd send this sheet to most funders, but you can fill that in and then extract some of the key highlights to write in a letter to funders to keep them in touch. That way, they're much more likely to want to fund you again when you're doing another project. No funder's going to take away your grant because you didn't meet your targets, as long as you spent your money on the thing you said you were going to spend it on. But it will hugely improve your chances of getting future funding from that grant maker if you achieve those targets, or even if you don't achieve the targets, but you communicate really well why this is and what you're doing about it. Next, a quick word about COVID-19. If you held a grant from a trust before COVID, you'll probably know already that many grant makers are being very flexible about what you can spend that funding on. And most of them are really happy for you to spend it on whatever is required to keep your organisation afloat during the current crisis. But as always with these things, communication is absolutely the key. And you should check with any funder before implementing changes to how you're spending their funds. Just talk to them. Of course, as we go forward, it's very likely that any project involving people being in a place, even building projects where the site is inside, may well be affected by current or future local lockdowns or other restrictions. So if you're making applications now for any kind of project funding, you need to make sure you explain to funders, how is our project still going to be deliverable in those kind of scenarios? Have you considered the impact that a local lockdown, say, might have on what you're able to achieve? Now, my experience is that funders are really sympathetic, really helpful, really realistic. They will not expect you just to be able to carry on like you did before, but they will want you to have a plan and to show that you thought about these things. It's worth saying here, if you don't already have one for your church or for your big projects, it can be really helpful to create and maintain a risk register. You've probably come across that term, but if you haven't, it tracks a list of things that might damage your ability to deliver a project or your effectiveness in delivering it. And there's a really helpful guide to risk registers on the Church of England's Parish Resources website. And again, the address is there. Really encourage you to go and check that out. Finally then, the one thing that really matters. The most important thing, as you think about project outcomes and outputs and evaluation and reporting, the most important thing is just to remember why those things are here. They should not be just a thing that you do for funders. This kind of impact reporting is for you, not the funder. Now, your funder might have particular formats and a timeline and a date you need to send a report. You know, that might be a bit of a pain. But if you approach this reporting with the mentality that this is just a hump for us to jump through, you've totally missed the point of it, and it will become really, really tedious. So please remember that the fundamental reason for deciding what you're trying to achieve and then for monitoring and evaluating that is so you can actually do more of the things you want to do as a church. These kind of outputs, outcomes, and evaluation exist to help you do more things more effectively by making you ask good questions about what is working, what isn't working, and why. And if you approach this with that kind of conviction, what will happen is that you will design better projects in the first place, you will make better decisions, and you will reach more people in spiritual and material need in your community. So we've covered the key things then. I hope you feel by the time we've got to here that you understand the key terms, outputs, outcomes, and impact reporting, that you have some idea how to go about deciding what you will measure and report on, always starting with the end, starting with what you want to achieve, what difference you want to make. I hope you've learned a little bit about how to measure those outputs and outcomes, some numerically and some more by surveys and more subjective things. We thought a bit about what to do once you've got the money and how to communicate with the various different funders. We've considered the COVID-19 context and particularly mentioned risk registers as a really useful tool going forward. And most of all, we thought about the one thing that really matters, which is that these tools are designed for you to create better projects that make more difference in your community.
Thanks, Andrew. I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk about measuring the success of your project from a funder's perspective. All Churches Trust has been on quite a journey with regard to impact measurement over the last couple of years. And we've been growing in our understanding of the impact that our funding has on those that we give grants to and how we can measure our own success. Now, as part of that process, we've been working on being clearer about what we're looking for from applicants about the impact and outcomes they hope to achieve, and providing resources to help applicants with project planning. And that second aspect is really key because good impact measurement starts with good project planning. So being clear about what you're going to do and how it's going to make a difference. But before you even get to what you're going to do, it's important to be clear about why you're going to do something at all. So if you're applying to All Churches Trust for a grant, one of the key things we'll ask you to tell us about is the need or opportunity that you want to respond to through the project, and anything you can tell us about how you know it exists. Perhaps you've carried out some research or some surveys, or have some other way you can show us why this project is important for you to carry out and why you need our help to fund it. Then we ask you to give us a summary of the eventual impact or the ultimate difference you want to make through the project and how it relates to the need or opportunity that you've told us about. Next, we ask for that eventual impact to be broken down into outcomes, so the short to medium term changes you want to see that will contribute to that eventual impact or the difference you want to eventually make. Now, for bigger projects, it's likely there'll be quite a few outcomes. For smaller projects, perhaps just a couple or maybe even just one. But no matter how many outcomes you have, we think these are what is really most important to measure in some way, and therefore to work out what information you need to capture and how you're going to capture it to know whether you're achieving those outcomes. Starting a new group or activity and counting how many people are attending is helpful and good to measure, but it's probably best described as an output, as Andrew was explaining. So it's really the difference or the change there's been as a result of the new group that's more important, and therefore particularly good to think about how to measure. Finally, we ask, what do you need to help achieve your outcomes in order to see that eventual impact happen, and therefore meet the need or seize the opportunity that you've told us about? Is it better buildings or equipment or new resources or perhaps more people? Essentially, what do you need a grant for? You'd be surprised how many applications we receive where that really isn't all that clear. Now, the kinds of costs that we will help to fund varies in our grants programs, but the principle is the same. Being clear about what our grant would be spent on, and therefore ultimately what it will help to achieve. Now, sometimes people say to us, well, we've only got a small project. It's not going to cost all that much. Why do you need all this information? Well, we're certainly not trying to make life difficult for anyone. The truth is that the information we ask for and the format we ask for it in helps us to understand what our funding will help to achieve. And that's really important because we have to be able to demonstrate that we've used our funds well, whether we're helping to fund small projects or larger ones. But we really hope that what we ask applicants to provide also helps them to think clearly about why they're embarking on their project, what it will achieve, and ultimately how to know whether they've made the difference through it that they were hoping to. And that's important for projects of all sizes. And knowing whether you've made the difference you set out to make is, of course, where measuring the success of your project ultimately comes in. It may not always be easy, but it's certainly possible if you've really thought about what success would look like early on in your planning. Of course, we love to hear about what's happened through the projects we've helped to fund, and the feedback we look for will depend on the grants program you've applied to. And we normally give around 1,200 grants a year, so we can't ask for or read detailed reports on every project. But if you receive a grant from us, do keep in touch with us about what you've achieved with our help, whether that's through formal reports or responding to surveys we send out, or more informally. We love to share stories and case studies on our website to help encourage and inspire others thinking about applying to us. And if you decide to apply to us again in the future, it will certainly be helpful to know the difference that you've been able to make with our help previously. Well, you can find out more about what we fund, how to apply, and access a wide range of resources to help you plan your project and think about how you'll measure its success on our website at www.allchurches.co.uk, along with examples of some of the impactful projects we've helped to fund previously. Well, I hope that's been helpful from a funder's perspective. Back to you, Andrew.
Well, I hope you found that helpful. I guess you may have loads of questions and things that you'd like to know more about, or things that weren't perhaps clear, or specific things that relate to your project as a church. So we've got about 15 minutes now to have questions and answers, and I'll do my best to help you move this forward in your particular context.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Jeremy, for sharing your insights. I hope that everyone watching found that helpful and you learned a little bit about impact reporting and why it's so important. My name's Catherine Keeper and I am the fundraising coordinator at Ecclesiastical, and I'm delighted now to have the opportunity to pass some of your questions on to Andrew live to answer during our Q&A. So thank you to everyone who submitted a question. We really appreciate those coming in. We've got a few specific questions about impact reporting, and then we've also received a couple of more general fundraising queries from you, which we'll also try to answer. If you'd like to submit a question now, please do. There's a box underneath your screen that's titled submit a question. If you just enter your details and your question in there and press submit, we will try our best to get round and respond to you. So firstly, Andrew, I'm going to jump in from this question from the Diocese of Canterbury, and they ask, how can we gauge impact in terms of missional engagement?
Thanks, Catherine. That's a great question that they've asked. I'm going to unpack this in a bit of detail because I think it's a really important question, and there's a couple of things that I think it's worth people considering. So the first one is around what is it that you're going to measure in terms of missional engagement, and how easy are those things to actually measure. Some of the things that you might want to measure that are more core measurements of your church's mission in the world, I guess, are not that difficult. So, absolutely, if your project is about doing things in your building or about improving the offer that you have in your community, looking at how many people attend on a Sunday would be a really great measure to use. And whoever is funding you, that's a measure of your church's effectiveness in your community. So I'd always measure that, and counting those sorts of things: how many people come to a youth work, how many older folk come along to a lunch club. They're fairly straightforward things to do. And in a way, even if no external funder is asking you to measure those things, measuring those things for yourself as a church so you can understand the patterns and what's going on and what's working and what's not working, really important, really helpful. So that's the first thing I'd say. Second thing is there are then some other things which are much more difficult to measure. So how do you measure somebody's spiritual growth? For example, that might be a thing that you're really concerned about as a church, not just that the people who come to your church come and bring more people, which is a great thing, but that those people are actually growing in their understanding of the gospel, in the way they're living out the Christian life in their communities. That's much harder to measure, but not impossible. I think we might have a question later on in terms of what sorts of tools do we use to measure things where people are reporting about themselves. But that's the best way to measure those things. Just ask people. In the church that I used to pastor, we basically had a survey that we did every year where we asked all the people who came on a particular Sunday, how do you feel you've done in the last year in your spiritual journey? Do you feel you've grown in understanding? Do you feel you've grown in your ability to live out your faith in different situations in your workplace? And trust that people will report honestly about how they're doing. So that's that aspect. I guess the other thing about missional engagement is who wants to know. So if you're getting funding from funders whose way of thinking about the world is broadly speaking Christian, and they are interested in the Christian stuff that your church does, they're interested in people becoming Christians and being baptized and all of those things, then absolutely report those things back to those funders, and they will be interested in that, and they will understand which things are hard to measure and which things are easy to measure. Then there's another bunch of funders whose terms of reference, the thing they're looking for, is much more secular. It's much more about community engagement. It's much more maybe about things like loneliness, about things like poverty. What I would say is where things are obviously about what your church does, it's fine to tell them about those things as well. But don't go into a lot of stuff that you are interested in that they're not interested in. That's not being dishonest with anybody. It's just actually helping people who are interested in a particular thing to stay focused on the thing they're interested in.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And I hope Andrew's response was helpful for you there. The next question we've got coming in is from St Wilfrid's in Kenham. So thank you for your question. And they ask, should we employ a third party to assess the impact of our project?
Hi, St Wilfrid's. Great question. My answer is going to be, it depends, I'm afraid. In general, my answer would be no. So for most projects that most churches do, I don't think you need to employ a third party. And I hope that, having heard the webinar, you feel reasonably confident that the sorts of things that you need to be measuring are in fact things that you in-house with your team that you've got are perfectly capable of doing. It's not rocket science. You're able to do this for the vast majority of projects. There are some projects where maybe
the project is very big and very expensive. Maybe the thing that you're trying to measure is quite complicated. I don't know, perhaps you're doing a project with young people in your town who have had substance abuse issues, and you're trying to measure whether the thing you've done has any measurable difference in their relapse back into substance abuse or use of other services, those kinds of things. When you've got something like that, it can be helpful to have someone who's particularly expert in measurement to come along and do that. You know, a relatively quick Google search will find you good people who are able to do that for you. And if you are thinking about that, or you've got a project like that, make sure that you include the cost of doing that impact assessment in the money that you bid for in the first place in order to deliver the project, and certainly make sure you include it in your budget. So broad brushstrokes answer, generally you can probably do this yourself, but if it's very complicated or a very big project, it is sometimes worth building in some funding to have that done by someone else who's a specialist.
Thanks, Andrew. And as you mentioned, I hope that you found this webinar helpful to help you measure your impact in-house. Our next question is that you mentioned, Andrew, surveys to measure impact and asking people questions and how they feel. Do you have any tips on how a church could do these, and a bit more advice on actually carrying these out?
Yeah, it's a great question. Of course, it's particularly difficult at the moment because of all the sort of social distancing stuff and some of the regulations about COVID. So, you know, perhaps, you know, in normal circumstances, if you wanted to survey, you know, how effectively you're impacting your community, you could just go round and knock on people's doors and ask them. And that's probably a bit more difficult at the moment because even in places where you're still allowed to do it, people might be a bit nervous about that and so forth. So appreciating the difficulties. Having said that, I think there are some things you can very easily do. So if what you're surveying is people who are using a service that you're delivering, whether that's they're using it in your building still, which I guess often we are, or they're using it remotely, you already have some contact with those people. And I would survey those people in the same way that you have contact with them. So if you're contacting them face to face and they're coming to your building for something every week still, I would have a paper form that people can, fill in with pens, put in a box, leave it alone for 72 hours and then take them away and do stuff with it. If you're contacting them maybe by email or some of the digital means, I would do the survey in the same way that you're contacting them. So send out an email survey, create a web form, those kind of things. So that's sort of mechanism. In terms of what you put in the survey, I mean, the general things are keep it as short as you can. So gather all the information you need to gather, but don't get any more because people are much more likely to fill in a short survey than a long one. Have as many of the questions as possible with things like multiple choice answers or where people select a list of options rather than just open answers. So having one or two open answers where people can write what they think is great, but don't have loads of them because people tend to get put off filling them in. And also it's quite difficult then to compare one person's answer with another if they're just blocks of text, much easier if they're selecting from multiple choice things. And the other thing is to say, at the moment, particularly if you're in a place with a sort of tier 3 level lockdown, like people will understand if you can't do that right now. So just it's fine to hold off for a bit and then plan to do it once things are a little bit easier, as we all hope they will be within the next few months.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. And our next question is really interesting, and it's how important are well-being outcomes to funders? And this church specifically are looking to develop a new community hall.
That's a really good question and really pertinent and topical, perhaps even more than before this March. Wellbeing outcomes are incredibly important to most funders, whether those are Christian funders or secular funders. And by wellbeing outcomes, I guess our questioner is talking about a range of things that are related to people's broader health. So that might be how lonely are they feeling? It might be how contented are they with their life? It might be to do with being able to cope with their financial situation or some of their relationships. So those sorts of issues, lots of people are really interested in those. They're amongst the most difficult things to measure objectively. So again, you'll often be into measuring them using just self-reporting and people talking about how they're feeling about things. But they are really important. And I think they're one of the things that churches are just really great at. Churches are absolutely brilliant at improving people's well-being, because churches create communities of meaningful relationship that help people to navigate all the difficult things in life. And we can sometimes underestimate just the importance of the kind of things that churches do to help people's lives be bearable. You know, we're so often focused on wanting to offer people solutions and solve the problems and make things okay, which just, you know, the world being the way it is, sometimes you can't do, that we overlook the fact that people being in these meaningful communities helps them to cope with things as they are, even if they can't necessarily be changed. So don't short sell yourself as a church on the difference that you make. And absolutely, how people feel and their well-being is really important to funders. So make sure you include those measures in what you're trying to do.
Great, thanks for that, Andrew. We're now going to move on to a couple of questions that aren't as strictly related to impact, but more just about grant funding and fundraising generally. So St Mary's Church asks, we're reluctant to drain our cash reserves. Is funding still available if we have cash in the bank?
Good question, St Mary's. I think, as so often, the answer is a little bit, it depends. So partly depends how much cash you've got in the bank and what that cash is for. So the fundamental question I want to ask for here is, what are your reserves about? Why do you have reserves? So it seems to me that the point of reserves is to cover the cost of emergencies and of really difficult situations. And actually, if at the moment you're not using any of your reserves, kind of think, what sort of emergency do you think is going to happen that's worse than what is going on at the moment that you're holding this money for? So don't feel like you can't spend reserves. They are there for an emergency so that you can spend them. So, you know, if you need to spend them, it's absolutely much better to spend them than it is to kind of hold on and cut everything that you do and all the rest of it. Trust funders and other grant makers are very happy to fund organisations that have some cash in the bank. And in fact, if you have no cash at all in the bank, they will be a bit reluctant to fund you because they might worry that you're not still going to be here in 6 months' time. But there's kind of an optimum. And generally speaking, you know, if you read things produced by the Charity Commission, guidance produced by trust funding bodies, if you've got between 3 months and 12 months of your costs, your typical expenditure in the bank, that's generally speaking fine. If you've got much more than a year's money in the bank, you've probably got more than you need, unless you set it aside for some very specific purpose and you can explain what that is. And you probably need to at least put in some of your own money to the project as well as looking for money from outside. If you've got less than 3 months cash in the bank, I would suggest you would need to concentrate on reducing your expenditure, growing your kind of regular income from your congregation, and coming back to that point where you've got a reasonable amount of reserves before you start trying to do new projects. Because one of the things, particularly about new projects, where it's a building project or a youth worker project or something, is that you may well have to spend money before you get money back in. And actually that can create real cash flow problems, which you really don't want. So don't be reluctant to spend your reserves if there's a good reason for it. 3 to 12 months reserves, generally absolutely fine. Much more than that, okay, if there's a really good reason for it that you can articulate. Much less than that, concentrate on building those reserves.
Great, thank you, Andrew, and I hope that response is helpful. Another interesting question here from St Bartholomew's Church, which I'm sure a lot of others can relate to at the moment, which is, because of COVID-19, we can't raise 50% of the funds which are usually required to access a grant. And they're asking for any suggestions or tips about how they could make up that money at the moment.
Really good question. Very much depends on the funder. So quite a lot of funders, so particularly if you're going to things like the various Lottery Heritage Fund, the other lottery funds will fund more than 50% of the total cost of your project, particularly for smaller projects. So, you know, if you've got a project that's going to cost £15,000 or £20,000, there are funders around who might be perfectly happy to fund 70 or 80% of that. So make sure you look at those first. There is a reason why funders don't want to fund the whole thing generally, especially if it's not a tiny project, which is they just want to be confident that this is not entirely dependent on them and that it might actually be able to carry on, or that the church carries on being viable beyond their contribution. So there's a good reason for it. So yeah, look at the ones that give more first. Actually, if you're at 60% and you've got 40% to go, often people in the church will give that money. And often the 50% that you need to raise isn't doesn't have to be from outside all grant makers. It just has to be not from the same grant maker. So if you can get 2 grant makers who will both give you 50% of the money, then you're absolutely fine, and you've got your 100%. The problem comes with that, like, everybody wants the other person to go first, and I appreciate that can be difficult. I would just look at the ones that give you the most first, then find some smaller local trusts will often give you bits and pieces to get you started. Ask around in the congregation and do your own bits first. And I hesitated to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Don't just say because of COVID you can't do this, because actually COVID potentially means you can raise more money. It could mean you can raise less money, but you need to try first. So don't just assume, and I obviously don't know the situation in the church, that's the question. Maybe you really tried hard and you haven't been able to, but don't assume that you can't get the first 50% because of COVID. Actually, you might be more able to get it because of COVID, because people are more aware of the need than they were before. So, like, give it a good go before you decide that it's not possible.
That's interesting. Thanks, Andrew. And we've got a question here from St Mary's in Woodborough, who over the next 4 years are going to be doing some serious fundraising for fabric repairs, and they're asking of any suggestions for suitable grant making organisations for that.
Hi, St Mary's. Great that you're doing that. Really important to keep churches in good order, maintain all those amazing buildings for the use of communities for years to come. So good on you. Well done with that. Yeah, absolutely. So depending on the status of your building a little bit. So if you've got a listed building, then there are a whole bunch of church-related organisations that fund specific fabric repairs around listed buildings. Sounds to me like you're an Anglican church, so ask your diocese, they will definitely know who all those are. All Churches Trust, which is the charitable arm of ecclesiastical insurance, are extremely generous and very good at helping churches to fund capital projects, so I would definitely have them on your list. If your building is old and listed, again, National Lottery Heritage Fund is a really good source of funding, so that's worth a look. The Garfield Weston Foundation, very generous with church buildings and giving to those things, particularly where there are community outcomes and projects. So those would be some really great ones to start with. There's a whole bunch of guides, books and online guides that you can use, things like the Directory of Grant-Making Trusts. So your local library might well be able to help with those. And if you Google search something like Funds Online, that's a potential source of information as well. You have to pay a subscription for that, but sometimes you'll find somebody like your local council for voluntary service may already have a subscription. They may let you piggyback on that or use their search facilities for a small fee. So worth looking at all of those things.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And just one final question that we have time for today, which is related to the previous, is St James's Church in Doncaster are looking for funding for mechanical and electrical installations specifically. And I just wondered if you have anything to add to your list that you gave.
So yeah, definitely all of the ones that I already listed would probably look at that. I think the other thing I would do is there will be in your area, did you say Doncaster?
Yeah.
So you're South Yorkshire. So there will be a community foundation, South Yorkshire Community Foundation in your county, and they will have a really good handle both on a whole range of people who give money into funds that they then distribute. So they may have some money themselves, but they'll also almost certainly know other places locally that you could go. So I would definitely contact South Yorkshire Community Foundation, and whichever county in the UK you live in, there is a community foundation there as well. So same thing applies, but just Google search your county community foundation and you'll find the one near you.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I'm afraid that's all the questions we have time for today. So thank you to everyone who submitted a question, and thanks, Andrew, for your responses. I hope that you picked up some useful tips and found that really helpful. And remember, there's always more support and resources available on our fundraising hub and helpline. And if you have a further question about fundraising, we'd love to hear from you. So please do get in touch by calling the helpline or submitting your question on our site. So I'd now like to pass back to Richard Coleman, who's going to give a short closing to the session.
So finally, just by way of wrapping up, I do need to say a few thank yous. Firstly, a big thank you to Andrew and Jeremy for participating in the webinar today. I really hope you found it useful. Secondly, thank you to you for giving up your time and engaging with us on this really important topic. Finally, as I've mentioned, this recording will be uploaded to the Church Fundraising Hub, and there are loads of other useful resources there, as I've already mentioned. Just go to ecclesiastical.com/church fundraising. We've also set up a dedicated funding helpline manned by church insurance consultants, and you can find details of how to access that also on the website. So this is the last in our series of 5 webinars, but we're going to continue to upload further resources and further materials onto that fundraising hub to continue offering as much support as we can into the future. So for now, thank you very much for listening and engaging in our webinar today, and I wish you the best of luck in all of your fundraising activities. Goodbye for now.